Let's get into it now. A spoiler-free movie review. I want to talk about DC's Blue Beetle. And before I even get into this review, I have to issue a Mexican bias alert. Because I know, as a Mexican American going into this movie, I was going to enjoy it more than the average person because you have your first Latino star in a DC superhero movie, Jaime Reyes, played by Zola Maridueña. You have a Latino writer, director, and primarily Latino cast. So I feel like for me, this is the first time I'm really seeing my people represented on the big screen in my favorite genre. Why is it taking so long? So there were a lot of things in this movie that just hit with me that made me realize they made this movie exactly for people like me. All of the references, even the music and the character names. I just knew that they had me. Even when I walked into the theater, our entire row was taken up by a Mexican family, and that just warmed my heart as well. You had a mom, dad, brother, cousin, and a baby. I'm not the biggest fan of always bringing babies into PG-13 rated movies, but I asked the kid what his name was, and he said, Porfinio Mondragon. So I'm like, all right, let him in. So what this movie is about, our main character is named Jaime Reyes, and his life is changed forever after this alien relic chooses him as the symbiotic host, and he becomes the Blue Beetle. If you had to compare this movie to a Marvel movie, it's probably a lot like Ant-Man. So I feel like if anybody has a reason they're not going to like this movie, it's because maybe you didn't like Ant-Man. Maybe there's just something about making a superhero movie about an insect that people get turned off by unless you're Spider-Man. But the comic book elitists will say that Blue Beetle came out before Ant-Man. But I always look at it from a film perspective and whenever they first debuted on the big screen. What I did enjoy about Blue Beetle is it was a very good representation of what a kid like Jaime would go through, having this thing take over his body and transforming him into a superhero and navigating how to use these powers. I feel like there were a lot of moments in this movie that represented what I would do in this situation of figuring out how to fight, not wanting to kill other people, and overall just being overwhelmed by the process, which is something I feel like isn't really represented in movies. Throughout this entire movie, you see Jaime really struggle with it and have to come to his own to be able to harness the powers of the Blue Beetle and therefore become the Blue Beetle. So I felt like there was a lot of growth in his character. And that was just one of the ways I related to his character in the movie. He is the first in his family to go and graduate college. That is where we find him at the start of this movie. He just gets home from college, and then his parents deliver some pretty bad news that they're going through a lot of financial struggles. His dad is having some health issues, so his world kind of comes crumbling down as he's trying to start his new life. He feels like he's now let his parents down and is trying to find a way to support his family. And this is where I'm going to get into the bias stuff, because I felt like Jaime and his family was such a great representation of the Mexican American family that I've not seen portrayed at this level on the big screen in a big Hollywood production. I always feel like Mexican American characters are minimized, and sometimes we're caricatures or just bad versions of what Mexican life is really like. But there were so many things in this movie that felt authentic to me, that I could tell that there were Latino actors trying to really portray things and put things in this movie that Mexicans actually do, that Mexicans actually listen to, that Mexicans actually eat. Even trucks that Mexicans actually drive. This was all represented in this movie. I feel like George Lopez's character was a great representation of that. His name is Rudy. I have a brother named Rudy, so right off the bat, I was like, that could be my brother right there. And from the very first time he was on screen, he pulled up in his truck listening to Los Tucanes de Tijuana, and I was like, that would be the equivalent if you grew up listening to country music and had never heard an Alan Jackson song in a movie, and that was the first time you heard it. That is how it felt to me. And then when it comes to the language, which is a big part of this movie, I love that Blue Beetle committed to using Spanish throughout the movie, and at times the Spanish wasn't even subtitles, and that felt more authentic to me. Because a lot of the stuff sometimes doesn't translate. I think if you grow up speaking Spanish, there are just some phrases we use that if you tried to translate it to English, it just wouldn't really make sense, but it makes sense to us. It's a pretty big risk using that much Spanish in a movie. You could turn a lot of people off, but I loved the commitment to it. They also balanced it pretty well with using Spanglish, going back and forth between English and Spanish, which is something that Mexican American families are just accustomed to. When your parents are from Mexico, your grandparents are from Mexico, you grow up in America, primarily you start learning English because you go to school here, but your parents still speak Spanish, and then through them going to work and living in this country for an extended period of time, they start to learn English, and the way we just communicate is mixing it all together. Oftentimes when I call my mom, Sometimes I'll speak to her in English. She'll speak back to me in Spanish. When I talk to my dad, kind of the same. Or sometimes we just go back and forth a lot. You could have an entire sentence where every other word is in a different language, and for some reason, we just get it. It works for us. And that is what was shown a lot in Blue Beetle. And it never felt forced or cheesy to me, which always turns me off in a movie when they have to overemphasize words like tortilla, taco, and stuff like that. I just rather them not use it at all. But in this case, I loved every instance of it. Everything from the way that their house looked. They had the Virgen de Guadalupe on the wall, from the TV shows they were watching, from the music they were listening to, like I mentioned before. Everything about it just felt so authentic. And then it comes to the characters, which I did relate a little bit with Jaime. Like I said earlier, being the only male in my family to go and graduate college, but he's also just like really good looking. So there was other things about his personality that wasn't exactly me, but the character that just kind of struck with me so much was the dad. If my dad was taken out of the real world and put onto the big screen, it would be Jaime's dad. And I felt like his character was so important for me, just feeling this emotional connection to this film. Without the dad, I probably wouldn't have felt this movie as much in my heart. But just the way he acted, the way he cared about his family, even just the way he spoke and the way he looked, that real just blue collar, working hard to provide for his family mentality, that is my dad. The character here is probably a little bit more positive than my dad. My dad curses a lot more and isn't as poignant with his feelings, but deep down, that is exactly my dad, especially the scene where he was having a heart-to-heart with his son and he was drinking a beer and telling him not to tell his mom. I've had many instances of that with my dad. And that's all I'll say about his dad. I do want to give a spoiler version of this review, getting all the topics, and I'll talk more about his dad as I'm going to start getting emotional thinking about this movie again, which is something I really wasn't expecting for this movie to do. But I will share the line about coming to this country, and he said that crossing the border is hard, but you know what's harder? The 20 years after. And that was so true. I thought of my dad, who came here as a teenager. He worked all these various jobs, from cleaning escalators to doing maintenance to being a mechanic, doing yard work, and finally found his way being a truck driver and has now done that for over 30 years. So yes, coming to this country is hard, but what's even harder is building a life here and doing all the things to achieve that American dream. So that line is one of my favorite lines in any DC movie. And also just the fact that we finally have our own superhero now. The hard part comes in is I don't know what's going to happen to Blue Beetle after this. He's not really connected with the DCEU. We have Aquaman coming later this year, and it seems like James Gunn is just going to scrap everything and start new with Superman and build in all these characters. So I don't know what's going to happen with Blue Beetle. Will we get another movie? Probably not. And it hurts even more that it didn't really make much at the box office, which it wasn't really expected to. They didn't really spend that much on marketing or promotion. The budget was $104 million. And it opened to $43 million worldwide, which isn't great. And out of all the DCEU domestic opening weekend totals, it is at the bottom. It is behind The Flash. It is behind Shazam 2. Blue Beetle only opened to $24.5 million in the United States. But when I look at all these DCEU movies, everything from Man of Steel to Suicide Squad, Wonder Woman, Justice League, Aquaman, the first Shazam, Birds of Prey, the only thing I would rank higher than this movie is the Suicide Squad. That's the only one. Maybe Man of Steel, given the day. Maybe it's because I just watched Blue Beetle and I have recency bias. But it was just so good that I feel like the money that it's made doesn't really represent the film. And that is a rare case. And I come on here and often I try not to just all out bash DC. I always give them the benefit of the doubt because they have such great characters. And this is a case where I don't even feel that it's getting that much hate. It just didn't really do that well because people weren't hyped about it. And you also have the strike going on. They couldn't really promote it as much. So the summer blockbuster season is also dwindling down right now, that I feel like maybe it wasn't the right time for it to come out, but also it's hard to sell a brand new character. And it's also speaking to a very niche audience if you are focusing on the Mexican demographic. But I feel like this is a movie everybody should get a shot to because I want to see more characters like this on the big screen. Doesn't always have to be a superhero movie, but I just love big blockbusters with Mexican faces in it. It just makes me happy. So now it comes down to what I will rate Blue Beetle. Let me remind you of my Mexican bias. I would honestly say, if I wasn't Mexican and if I hadn't related with all of these characters, it would probably on its own be a 3 or a 3.5 at best. But the fact that this movie really got me emotionally and I was so invested in all these characters and it felt so familiar to me and it brought so much joy to see things that I've never seen in a movie from my background, from my culture. I saw me in this movie, I saw my dad in this movie, and I left the theater just completely riding a high that I had never really felt before. So again, probably a 3 to you if you're not Mexican, maybe a 3.5 if you just love DC. But I'm going to give Blue Beetle a 4.5 out of 5 scarabs. And I will say, at times, the acting is a little bit cheesy. That is probably what kept me a little bit out of it in the beginning. I'd say in that first 10 to 15 minutes, it felt a little bit like a cheesy action movie to me. Like there's a big dark villain, and then you have this nice kid, and then they're all gonna clash together. And I was worried about that. But once the action got going at the end of that first act, I felt like that cheesiness kind of went away. It creeps back every now and then. And this movie doesn't really go way beyond the superhero formula. It stays pretty close to it. So again, this is with the Mexican bias, also with it hitting me more emotionally, which I will explain more in the spoiler review. So probably on a normal day, I would have given it a 4. But because of the impact it had on me, I'm sticking with that 4.5 out of 5 scarabs.